Hello everyone, and welcome to this, my latest video tutorial. It's a beautiful river and we're starting now. The base for this piece was an A3 board of extruded polystyrene, and then I cut thinner boards to mark out the shape of the land. I just drew the river on with a felt tip pen, including an island, as this was going to be a double streamed river, if indeed that's what they're actually called. In any case, I cut along the lines, making sure I used a very sharp blade. And then I stuck these on another sheet of extruded polystyrene using the Hot Wire Foam Factory's Styrogoo. This creates a very firm bond very quickly and can be cut using the hot wire tools. I then bonded this top sheet to the base sheet of styrene using the Hot Wire Foam Factory glue again. A little goes a long way with this glue, and you can spread it out using a lolly stick or a palette knife. I built the land up further using extra pieces of polystyrene. The Hot Wire Foam Factory were kind enough to send me this kit, which included their freehand router. It uses a stiff but flexible wire which you can bend into the shape you desire. I used it to cut down through the layers of polystyrene to create the river channel. You can get very neat cuts with this tool, but I wasn't interested in making this too neat at this stage, since this was all going to get covered anyway. My main focus was just on getting the shape of the river carved out of the polystyrene. As you can see, I wasn't very neat at all, but that was fine, because the next step was to cover the river and the landscape with Sculptamold. It's best to mix this to a fairly thick consistency, otherwise it will take many hours to dry, possibly 3 or 4 days. I always mix it into a very stiff paste. Then it's just a case of spatulaing it onto the landscape and working it into the shapes you desire. And at this consistency, you've probably got about 20 minutes before it becomes unworkable. I find 20 minutes for this stage is more than enough time. And it remains smoothable with a finger for quite some time after that, and even if it has gone a bit hard, you can give it a spray of water and keep smoothing it over with your fingers. Here I was after a very smooth texture because this was going to be the banks of the river, which I imagined would have been smoothed by the water. I used Mod Podge matte to go over the riverbed. A fairly thick layer so that I could fix stones to the riverbed. And these are just sifted from some coarse sand. A thorough spray with scenic glue helped the stones adhere even more to the surface. Then I pressed on pieces of old plaster rock castings as small boulders that will have tumbled down the river. And now it was time to give the model a base coat of burnt umber. Any brown will do really. This is just to stop the white showing through as we add further scenic materials. And I go over the whole model, including the riverbed. The first scenic material I use is dried soil and beige grout, sifted through an old pair of tights to create a realistic dirt texture on the banks. This was applied directly over the wet paint, and some of it got on the riverbed, but that didn't really matter. And then a spray with isopropyl alcohol and then scenic glue further held the dirt texture in place. And now it was time to paint the riverbed, and for this I used some more burnt umber mixed with a little bit of black, and I thoroughly diluted it so that it would flow all around the rocks on the riverbed. And then I just dabbed it on down the centre of the river to create the illusion of depth. However, I wasn't after too much depth because this is a shallow river, more of a stream really. Where the paint had got onto the banks, I just touched it up with some more dirt mixture. And then I got on with highlighting some of the river stones. I used some brighter yellows and raw umbers here, and a little bit of grey. And I dry brushed over the boulders with a bit of grey as well. And I gave the smaller stones a more general dry brush with several different tones to lend a realistic appearance to the riverbed. Further realism was achieved with the use of Woodland Scenic's fine turf. This is their green blend, and it makes rather nice river moss or algae. A further dusting with fine turf burnt grass added a little bit more subtlety to the moss. And it also provided nice texture and shading along the riverbanks. I highlighted the edges of the riverbanks using clay dust. I just sprinkled it along where I fancied, and then used a brush just to brush it onto the edges of the banks. And all this required another thorough spray with isopropyl alcohol and then the scenic glue mixture, which is 3 parts matte medium and 1 part water. I like using pieces of 12mm grass matting by Gauge Master. I just cut pieces off it, making sure to round off any corners. And then I stick it down onto the landscape using Mod Podge matte, although any white glue would do. Pressing it down firmly so that no gaps show under the edges. The rest of the static grass was 6mm knock grass, and this was a mixture of wild grass, beige and green, which I put into the static grass hopper, and then after applying some more undiluted Mod Podge matte around the edges of the grass matting pieces, I hold the hopper about 2 cm above the surface of the model and shake the grass out. I could then turn the model upside down and pat the back to get off plenty more static grass to use on a later piece. And I made sure to brush any excess off the riverbed, and then used some more of the fine turf to blend in the grass to the dirt texture. Again with the isopropyl alcohol and scenic glue to fix all of that in place. And now another trick I picked up from Luke Towan. I'm using real roots to model tree roots on the eroded river banks, and these were just weeds from my garden. A spot of tacky glue and they fix on quite securely. I wanted to add some taller sections of beige grass, but I didn't have any grass long enough, so I used some jute twine cut into sections, which I then pulled apart into their strands to create a fine spread, which I could then glue into the static grass with a small bit of tacky glue. And then to further accent the banks, I used some ground up dried fern leaves, which are very good at representing actual dried up leaves. And I also used some mid-green knock leaves to do the same job. All of this can end up looking a little bit clumpy, so it's a good idea to give the land a little brush. And then I added some larger bushes using coarse turf by Woodland Scenics. This is their mid-green variety. And I just pressed it into the grass in random patches where I felt it looked good. And yet again gave it a spray with isopropyl alcohol and then a thorough soaking with scenic glue. And at last it was time to pour the river, and for the dam I used masking tape, which I then sealed with some Mod Podge. Again, you could use any white glue. And I was careful to pull the masking tape quite taut and to make a nice sharp point so that the resin would have a nice clean edge. And the resin I used was water clear epoxy from CFS. I mixed it in equal parts as it says to do on the instructions. And then poured each part into a separate cup, which is important as you'll end up with an unequal ratio if you pour one part into the cup containing the other part, because you can never quite get all the resin out of the cup with the lolly stick. I actually wiped these cups out with a bit of isopropyl alcohol so I can use them again. And then it was a case of stirring the resin relatively slowly so as to avoid introducing too many bubbles. And I used some acrylic ink burnt umber to tint the resin. Just a few spots will do. It's very strong stuff, and if you overdo it, you'll lose the opacity of the resin. After a couple of minutes, the resin is ready to pour, and I go down the centre of the river first of all, and the resin finds its level as it goes round. If you're not quite sure how much resin you're going to need, it's best to mix it up in batches, which is what I did here, pouring on another cup of resin before the previous layer had had a chance to start drying. And I gently pushed it around into all the crevices, nooks, crannies and corners using a lolly stick. And then I realised I needed yet more resin because the river wasn't as deep as I wanted it to be. You tend to get a few bubbles in the resin, and you can burst these using a soldering torch. Make sure you don't hold it too close to the surface and just give it a light passing with the torch and the heat will burst the bubbles. And after about 12 hours the resin had cured and I could remove the masking tape. The resin tends to creep up the dam and the banks and anything embedded in it, but you can clear up any flashes with a very sharp blade, just be very careful. One of my favourite parts is adding the ripples, and for this I used Mod Podge gloss. I applied a relatively thin coat to a small area at a time, and then blew through a straw to push the Mod Podge around, which creates very realistic ripples. And then I carried on this process across the entire river, revisiting areas if I wasn't very happy with them, until the whole river surface was covered. And as you can see, once it's dried after a couple of hours or so, it creates a very realistic look. I created more pronounced ripples and further directed the flow of the river with some gloss gel. This goes on white but dries perfectly transparent. And I touched up the edges of the river where there was a slight lip to the resin. I used Vallejo snow and foam to create white water around the rocks. This stuff is basically a very thick acrylic and it dries very hard, so be careful not to go too thick with it. You can stipple it with the end of your brush. I wasn't happy with the length of my long beige tufts, so I cut them down to size with some scissors. And then, using an old AeroPress coffee filter and Green Stuff World's leaf stamp, I made some tiny leaves to add an extra accent in the foliage along the banks. In fact, I left these in green acrylic wash overnight, but I forgot to film that. These leaves represent the bigger leaved plants that you often get along riverbanks. Just go fairly sparing with them, and then give them a good soaking with isopropyl alcohol and some scenic glue. For the trees, I'm using some seafoam by Gauge Master. I start off with a fairly big twig and then I pick bits off until I'm happy with the general shape of the tree. A coating of brown spray paint gives the bark the colour I want. And then a quick spray with some spray adhesive. Now this isn't the best spray adhesive to use because it's far too powerful. Ideally you want one that will give it a fine mist. And for the foliage I'm using Knock Leaves mid-green again. It's just a case of dusting them over the tree, being as careful as possible to avoid the trunk. But any bits you do get on the trunk can be picked off with a pair of tweezers. And then you can touch up the trunk with the colour of your choice. As this was going to be a lightly wooded scene, I made up quite a few of these trees. And to add some variation, I used one of my wireframe trees, and I have a tutorial for these trees available on my YouTube channel. It's quite a lengthy process, but the results are really worth it. And then I attached some seafoam pieces with knock leaves to the ends of the armature. I think this is a really nice looking old oak tree. To attach the smaller trees to the landscape, I used a pin vise to make a small hole, put in a small squidge of tacky glue, and then just slotted each tree into place. Just bear in mind where you've put the roots sticking out of the banks so you can line the trees up accordingly. The oak tree was just stuck down with a big squidge of tacky glue. This of course took a little while to dry, but because of the root structure on the bottom of the tree, it's quite easy to stand the tree up and then leave it. And that was that. I was very pleased with this model. I think it turned out looking very realistic. And it was a great deal of fun to create, I have to say. Thank you ever so much for joining me again. I really do appreciate it. If you'd like to support me, please do share these videos as much as possible. Tell your friends, tell your family. I've been so pleased to hear from people on Instagram and here on YouTube who have been inspired by what I do to start creating their own things. It's very satisfying, and thank you ever so much for telling me. Please do keep writing to me, ask me questions. I'm happy to answer where I can. I'll see you again next time. Until then, thanks very much, and cheerio.